The hammer fell with the rhythm of a heart that had forgotten how to rest. Solomon Hayes wiped the sweat from his dark brow with the back of his sleeve, the cotton fabric already stained with the honest grime of iron and fire. In the pre-dawn darkness of Tredegar Iron Works, the largest foundry south of the Mason-Dixon line, Solomon's forge burned brightest among the dozens that lined the cavernous building like altars to industry. The October air carried the bite of coming winter through the high windows, mixing with the perpetual heat that rose from molten metal and glowing coals. Solomon had been at his station since 4 in the morning, as he had every day for the past 12 years, shaping iron that would bind a nation even as it sought to tear itself apart. His hands, scarred and calloused from countless encounters with hot metal, moved with the precision of a man who had transformed raw ore into something useful more times than he could count. Solomon. The voice cut through the industrial symphony like a blade. Master John Haxel, owner of Solomon and 43 other souls, approached with the measured stride of a man accustomed to obedience. His gray wool coat remained pristine despite the foundry's dust, a testament to his distance from the actual work of creation. "Yes, Master Haxel." Solomon set down his hammer and turned, though his eyes remained fixed on a point just past the white man's shoulder. Direct eye contact was a luxury he could not afford, no matter how many railroad executives praised his metalwork or how many orders specifically requested pieces forged by that skilled Negro blacksmith. "The Virginia Central Railroad has placed another substantial order," Haxel said, unfolding a piece of paper with the railroad company's letterhead. 300 rails, 50 bridge supports, and assorted coupling hardware. They need everything completed within 6 weeks for the new line extending south to Danville. Solomon nodded, already calculating the work required in his mind. The Danville extension was no secret in Richmond's industrial circles. Everyone knew it would facilitate the transport of enslaved people from Virginia's breeding farms to the cotton fields of the deeper South, where demand for labor continued to grow as the white gold of King Cotton expanded westward. "You understand the importance of this contract, don't you, Solomon?" Haxel's tone carried the weight of expectation and threat in equal measure. "The railroad men have specifically requested your work. They say your iron is the strongest, most reliable in the state. Don't disappoint them." "No, sir. I won't disappoint them." As Haxel's footsteps faded into the general din of the foundry, Solomon returned to his work, but his mind wandered to the small cabin he shared with his wife, Celia, and their 8-year-old son, Marcus, in the quarters behind Haxel's main house on Church Hill. Just yesterday, Celia had shared news that filled him with equal parts joy and terror. She was carrying their second child. The irony was not lost on him. Here he stood, forging the very infrastructure that would tear families like his apart, separating children from parents, husbands from wives, with the cold efficiency of market forces. Every rail he crafted was a link in the chain that bound his people to perpetual servitude. Every bridge support he shaped might carry a train full of souls being sold away from everything they had ever known. But Solomon Hayes was more than just skilled labor. Behind his careful deference and measured words lay a mind that had taught itself to read by studying discarded newspapers, a spirit that had never fully accepted the boundaries others sought to place upon it. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the foundry floor, an idea began to take shape in the deep recesses of his consciousness, an idea as dangerous as the molten iron he worked with every day. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his contemplation. James, a fellow enslaved man who worked the bellows at the forge next to his, approached with the cautious gait of someone bearing unwelcome news. "Solomon," James said quietly, his voice barely audible above the constant noise of hammer on anvil, "you need to know. Old Master's been talking to the overseer about changes." Solomon's hands never stopped moving, continuing to shape the glowing iron bar on his anvil, but his attention focused entirely on his friend's words. "What kind of changes?" "The kind that might separate families." James pumped his bellows with more force than necessary, the gesture betraying his anxiety. "I heard him talking about selling some of us to help finance expansion of his tobacco operation. Said the foundry's been so profitable he doesn't need as many hands here anymore." The hammer in Solomon's hand grew heavier. The specter of family separation haunted every enslaved person's existence, a constant reminder that their relationships existed at the whim of their owners' economic calculations. Children could be sold away from their parents as easily as livestock. Marriages had no legal standing. Love was a luxury that could be eliminated by a bill of sale. Did he mention names? Not specifically. But Solomon. James's voice dropped even lower. They've been asking questions about who has children, who might be planning to have more. Your Celia's condition isn't exactly hidden anymore. Solomon's strike went slightly off-center, sending sparks flying in an unusual pattern. He had learned long ago to school his features into impassivity, but James had known him for 8 years, since Solomon had first arrived at the foundry after being purchased from a failing plantation in Henrico County. I appreciate you telling me. We look out for each other, James replied, a statement that carried the weight of survival in a world designed to isolate and dehumanize them. That's all we can do. But as James returned to his station, Solomon found himself questioning whether that was truly all they could do. The iron bar on his anvil had cooled too much to work effectively, requiring him to return it to the forge's flames. As he watched the metal glow cherry red, then orange, then white-hot, he thought about the nature of transformation. Iron ore, when subjected to intense heat and pressure, became steel. Carbon, properly distributed, could turn something malleable into something strong enough to bear tremendous weight or sharp enough to cut through almost anything. Perhaps men, too, could be transformed by the right combination of heat and pressure. The morning continued with its familiar rhythm. Workers moved between forges like dancers in an industrial ballet, each knowing their role, their timing, their place in the larger production. Master Haxel made his rounds, occasionally stopping to examine finished pieces or to discuss orders with his foreman. The white overseers maintained their vigilant watch, ready to correct any perceived inadequacy with sharp words or sharper implements. But Solomon's attention kept drifting to the rail orders spread out on a wooden table near the foundry's office. 300 rails for the Danville line. 300 pieces of iron that would carry trains loaded with human cargo south to lives of unimaginable hardship. 300 opportunities to demonstrate either complicity or resistance. During the midday meal break, when the enslaved workers gathered in the foundry's yard to eat their rations of cornbread and salt pork, Solomon found himself studying faces. These were men he had worked alongside for years, men whose skills and intelligence had been honed by necessity and experience. Thomas, who could calculate the precise temperature needed for different grades of iron by the color of the flame. Henry, whose understanding of metallurgy surpassed that of most college-educated engineers. Samuel, who had developed innovative techniques for strengthening joints that were now being used throughout the South's growing railroad network. Each of these men possessed knowledge and ability that would have made them wealthy in a just world. Instead, their expertise enriched others while they received only enough compensation to keep them alive and productive. The bitter mathematics of slavery reduced human beings to economic units, their value measured solely by their capacity to generate profit for their owners. Solomon. The voice belonged to Abraham, the oldest man in the foundry at nearly 60 years of age. His hair had gone completely gray, and decades of heat had weathered his face like leather left too long in the sun. Walk with me. They moved to the edge of the yard, near the pile of coal that fed the forges. Abraham had been at Tredegar longer than anyone, arriving in the early 1840s when the foundry was still establishing its reputation. In the complex social hierarchy of enslaved life, age and experience commanded respect, and Abraham's words carried weight. "You've been thinking hard about something," Abraham observed. It wasn't a question. We all think hard about many things. True enough. But the kind of thinking you've been doing today, that's different. That's the kind of thinking that can get a man in serious trouble. Solomon met the older man's eyes directly, a breach of usual caution that spoke to the trust between them. What would you do, Abraham, if you knew your family was about to be torn apart? If you knew the work of your hands was being used to destroy other families? Abraham was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving across the foundry yard where dozens of men sat in small groups, sharing their meager meal and whatever news or rumors had reached them. "I'd remember that I'm not the first man to face such choices," Abraham finally said. "And I'd remember that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing at all." "But the risks." "Everything has risks, son. Doing nothing has risks. Doing something has risks. The question isn't whether there are risks, the question is what you can live with." That afternoon, Solomon began to examine his work differently. Each piece of iron he shaped, each rail he forged, each component he crafted for the Virginia Central Railroad received not just his technical skill but his analytical attention. He studied stress points, connection methods, the relationship between different metal compositions and their structural integrity. He began to understand not just how to make things strong, but how they might become weak. Iron, he knew, was only as reliable as its internal structure. Impurities, air bubbles, improper heating or cooling, any of these could create weaknesses that would remain hidden until subjected to the right kind of stress. A rail that appeared perfect might fail catastrophically if it contained internal flaws. A bridge support that seemed solid could buckle if its metallurgy was subtly compromised. For years, Solomon had taken pride in the perfection of his work. Railroad executives specifically requested iron forged by his hands because they knew it would perform flawlessly under the most demanding conditions. His reputation was built on reliability, on the absolute certainty that anything bearing his mark would function exactly as intended. But reputations, like iron bars, could be reshaped under the right conditions. As evening approached and the foundry began to wind down its daily operations, Solomon made his way home through Richmond's cobblestone streets. The city in 1856 was a study in contradictions, grand mansions and squalid shacks, bustling commerce and desperate poverty, the pinnacle of Southern sophistication and the foundation of human bondage that made it all possible. The walk from Tredegar to the Haxel property took him past the slave market on Wall Street, where auctions occurred 3 times a week. Even in the gathering dusk, Solomon could see the wooden platform where human beings were displayed like livestock, examined, evaluated, and sold to the highest bidder. The sight never failed to remind him of his own precarious position, the thin line between relative security and absolute vulnerability that defined every enslaved person's existence. Celia was tending to their small vegetable garden behind their cabin when Solomon arrived home. At 26, she possessed a quiet strength that had sustained their family through years of uncertainty. Her expanding belly showed clearly now beneath her simple cotton dress, and Solomon felt the familiar mixture of love and fear that accompanied the prospect of bringing another child into their world. "How was your day?" she asked, straightening to kiss his cheek. The question was routine, but her eyes searched his face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read subtle signs of trouble. "There's talk of changes," Solomon said simply. James heard Master Haxel discussing selling some of the foundry workers. Celia's hand instinctively moved to her stomach. Did he mention names? No names. But they're asking questions about families, about children. They stood together in their small garden, surrounded by the late autumn vegetables that would help sustain them through the coming winter. 8-year-old Marcus played nearby, building imaginary structures with sticks and stones, his young mind blissfully unaware of the forces that could reshape his world without warning. "What are you thinking?" Celia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Solomon looked at his wife, this woman who had shared his life for nearly 10 years, who had borne his son and now carried his second child, who had created a home in the space between their enslavement and their humanity. He thought about the rails he would forge tomorrow, the bridges he would build, the infrastructure he would create to facilitate the destruction of families just like his own. "I'm thinking," he said carefully, "that sometimes a man has to choose between being obedient and being human." That night, after Marcus had been tucked into his small bed and Celia had fallen into the deep sleep of pregnancy, Solomon sat by their cabin's single window and stared out at the Richmond skyline. Gas lamps flickered like earthbound stars, marking the streets where free people moved about their evening business, where decisions about the future belonged to those making them rather than being imposed from above. In the distance, he could see the glow from Tredegar's night shift, where workers continued to feed the South's industrial appetite. The foundry never truly slept. There was always metal to be melted, always orders to be filled, always profit to be extracted from the marriage of fire and iron. But tonight, as Solomon contemplated the rails he would forge tomorrow, he began to envision a different kind of marriage, between his technical knowledge and his desire for justice, between his reputation for reliability and his commitment to resistance, between the heat of his forge and the fire of his determination to protect his family. The plan that began to form in his mind was as dangerous as it was audacious. It would require not just courage, but patience, precision, and the ability to maintain his facade of obedience while systematically undermining the very system that enslaved him. One mistake would mean not just his own death, but potentially the destruction of his family and the punishment of everyone who had ever shown him kindness. Yet as he sat in the darkness, listening to the soft breathing of his sleeping wife and child, Solomon Hayes began to transform himself from a skilled craftsman into something far more dangerous. A man who had decided that some things were worth any risk. The November morning brought the first frost of the season to Richmond, coating the foundry's windows with delicate ice crystals that would melt away as soon as the forges reached full heat. Solomon arrived at his usual hour, but today he carried with him a notebook, a small, leather-bound volume that he had purchased with carefully saved coins from a free black man who sold books and paper to anyone with the means to buy them. The notebook was hidden beneath his jacket, pressed against his ribs like a secret too dangerous to reveal. Inside, written in the careful script he had taught himself through years of studying discarded newspapers and technical manuals, were calculations that would have condemned him immediately if discovered. Stress tolerances, temperature variations, the precise measurements of flaws that would remain invisible until subjected to catastrophic pressure. "Early again, I see," commented William, one of the white foremen, as he made his morning rounds. "Master Haxel says you're the most reliable Negro he's ever owned." "Yes, sir," Solomon replied, already heating his first piece of iron for the day. "Just trying to do good work." What William couldn't see was that Solomon's definition of good work had undergone a fundamental transformation. 4 weeks now, he had been studying railroad disasters, analyzing newspaper accounts of train derailments and bridge collapses, understanding the specific ways that flawed metal could fail. He had learned that the difference between a rail that would serve for decades and one that would fracture under stress could be measured in fractions of degrees during the forging process, in the precise timing of cooling, in microscopic impurities that would remain undetectable until the moment of catastrophic failure. The Virginia Central Railroad order had been divided among several of the foundry's most skilled workers, but the most critical components, the rails for steep grades and the primary bridge supports, had been specifically assigned to Solomon. His reputation demanded nothing less than the most important work. As the morning progressed, Solomon began implementing his plan with the methodical precision that had made him Tredegar's most valued craftsman. The first rail appeared perfect to any observer, its surface smooth and uniform, its dimensions exact to the railroad specifications. But deep within the metal structure, Solomon had introduced subtle flaws, microscopic air pockets created by precisely timed adjustments to his forge's temperature, internal stresses generated by calculated variations in his hammering rhythm. The work required extraordinary skill. Creating visible defects would have been simple. Any apprentice could ruin a piece of iron through carelessness or incompetence. But Solomon was crafting failures that would remain hidden until the moment when they were needed most, when a fully loaded train traveling at high speed placed maximum stress on what appeared to be perfect rails. "Excellent work, as always," Master Haxel commented during his midday inspection, running his hands along the first completed rail. "The railroad executives will be pleased. This kind of quality is what keeps Tredegar ahead of our competitors." Solomon nodded respectfully, hiding the bitter irony of the compliment. His quality had indeed improved, just not in the direction his owner imagined. But as the weeks progressed, the psychological strain of his double life began to take its toll. During the day, he maintained his facade of loyal productivity, accepting praise for work that he knew was designed to fail. At night, he wrestled with the moral implications of his actions. The train that would eventually derail might carry innocent passengers alongside its cargo of enslaved human beings. The bridge that would collapse might fall at a moment when its destruction would cause suffering to people who bore no responsibility for the system of bondage. These thoughts plagued him through the dark November nights, but they were soon overshadowed by events that crystallized his resolve and eliminated any remaining doubt about the righteousness of his path. The news came on a Tuesday morning in late November, delivered by a field hand who had run the 3 miles from the Haxel tobacco plantation on the outskirts of Richmond. Solomon was shaping a bridge support when he heard the commotion at the foundry's main entrance, the sound of urgent voices and running feet that signaled crisis. Master Haxel emerged from his office with a face darkened by rage, his usual composed demeanor replaced by the cold fury of a man who had suffered what he considered a personal affront. He strode directly to Solomon's forge, his boots ringing against the iron floor with each deliberate step. "Your friend Samuel," Haxel said without preamble, "has been caught teaching slave children to read." Solomon's hammer continued its rhythm, but his heart began to race. Samuel worked at the forge 3 stations down from his own, a quiet man in his 30s who had never spoken of any activities beyond his metalworking duties. The idea that he had been secretly educating enslaved children was both inspiring and terrifying. "I'm told he's been running a school in the woods behind the Randolph plantation," Haxel continued, his voice carrying the particular venom reserved for enslaved people who dared to exceed their prescribed roles. "Teaching letters and numbers to pickaninnies who have no business with such knowledge." The laws against enslaved literacy were absolute and brutally enforced. Knowledge was power, and power in the hands of enslaved people represented an existential threat to the entire system of bondage. A literate slave could forge passes, read abolitionist literature, communicate across distances, and most dangerously of all, understand the full scope of the injustices being perpetrated against them. "Samuel will be punished appropriately," Haxel said, his tone suggesting finality. "But first, I want to make sure his disease hasn't spread to others." "You've worked beside him for years, Solomon. Has he ever approached you about such matters?" "No, sir," Solomon replied truthfully. Samuel had never spoken to him about teaching, though now Solomon understood the careful way his colleague had sometimes watched the white workers reading newspapers, the subtle attention he paid when orders were being discussed. "Good. Because if I discover that any of my Negroes have been contaminated by such ideas, the consequences will extend far beyond the guilty parties." Haxel's eyes moved meaningfully toward the foundry yard where other workers continued their tasks, pretending not to listen to the conversation. Wives might find themselves sold south. Children might be separated from their families. "I trust you understand the implications." "Yes, sir. I understand completely." But as Haxel strode away to continue his investigation, Solomon realized that he understood far more than his owner intended. The message was clear: any act of resistance, any attempt to exceed the boundaries of accepted behavior, would result not just in individual punishment but in the destruction of families and communities. The system maintained itself through collective punishment, ensuring that every enslaved person remained responsible not just for their own compliance but for the obedience of everyone around them. The full scope of Samuel's fate became clear that afternoon. The man was brought to the foundry yard in chains, his back already bearing the marks of a severe whipping, his face swollen from blows that had closed one eye entirely. Master Haxel had arranged for all the enslaved workers to witness what followed: a public demonstration of the consequences of unauthorized education. "Let this be a lesson," Haxel announced as Samuel was forced to his knees in the center of the yard. This man forgot his place. He presumed to elevate himself above his station, to corrupt innocent children with ideas that would only bring them misery. His punishment will serve as a reminder of what happens when slaves attempt to become more than what God and nature intended them to be. What followed was a methodical brutality designed not just to punish Samuel but to terrorize every witness. 25 lashes with a leather whip, each one administered with deliberate precision to maximize both pain and humiliation. But the physical punishment was only the beginning. "Samuel will be sold immediately to a sugar plantation in Louisiana," Haxel announced as the broken man was dragged away. "His wife and children will remain here, as a reminder that the consequences of disobedience extend far beyond the guilty individual." Solomon watched his colleague disappear through the foundry gates, knowing that he would likely never see Samuel again. The sugar plantations of Louisiana were notorious for their brutal conditions and short life expectancy. Samuel's crime of teaching enslaved children to read and write had earned him what amounted to a death sentence, while his family was condemned to live with the knowledge that they would never see him again. But it was what happened next that finally shattered any remaining hesitation in Solomon's mind about the justness of his sabotage plan. That evening, as the enslaved workers returned to their quarters, Solomon heard the sounds of grief echoing from Samuel's cabin. The man's wife, Ruth, was keening with a sound that seemed to contain all the accumulated sorrows of their people. Their 2 young children, unable to fully comprehend their father's permanent absence, alternated between confused questions and inconsolable tears. Solomon found himself standing outside their door, listening to the sound of a family being destroyed by the casual cruelty of human bondage. Ruth's voice, when she finally managed to form words, carried a despair that cut through him like cold iron. "He was only trying to help," she whispered to the neighbor women who had come to comfort her. "Those children couldn't even write their own names. He just wanted them to have something they couldn't take away." But they had taken it away, Solomon realized. They had taken Samuel, they had taken his freedom to educate others, and they had taken his family's hope for any kind of future together. The system of slavery maintained itself through such calculated destruction, ensuring that every act of resistance resulted in suffering so severe that others would be deterred from similar attempts. As Solomon walked back to his own cabin that night, his wife and son sleeping peacefully within, he felt the weight of his decisions settling over him like armor. Samuel had been punished for trying to elevate others through education. Solomon would resist through his own expertise, using his skills not to enlighten but to undermine, not to build up but to tear down the infrastructure that sustained the system that had just destroyed his friend's family. The rails he would forge tomorrow would carry the seeds of their own destruction. The bridge supports he crafted would hold only until the moment when their failure would serve justice. His reputation for reliability would become a weapon against the very people who had created it. But first, he had to survive the increased scrutiny that Samuel's punishment had brought to all the enslaved workers at Tredegar. In the days following the public whipping, overseers paid closer attention to conversations, watched more carefully for signs of discontent, and questioned any deviation from established routines. Solomon's notebook remained hidden beneath loose floorboards in his cabin, but he had memorized its contents well enough to continue his work without referring to his written calculations. The Virginia Central Railroad order was now 2/3 complete. Solomon had crafted 97 rails, each one containing carefully hidden flaws that would remain undetectable until subjected to the stress of a fully loaded train. He had forged 18 bridge supports, their internal structure compromised by microscopic weaknesses that would cause catastrophic failure under precisely the wrong conditions. As December arrived with its shorter days and bitter cold, Solomon began the final phase of his sabotage operation. The most critical components, the rails that would be installed on the steepest grades and the primary supports for the longest bridge spans, required his most sophisticated techniques. These pieces would need to survive initial testing and inspection, perform adequately during the railroad's trial runs, and fail only when the line was operating at full capacity. The technical challenge was immense, requiring not just knowledge of metallurgy but an understanding of physics, engineering, and the specific operational characteristics of steam locomotives. Solomon had spent months studying every aspect of railroad operations, from the weight distribution of different types of cargo cars to the speed and braking patterns of various locomotive classes. His reputation for perfection had given him an unexpected advantage. Nobody questioned his methods or examined his work with the kind of scrutiny that might have revealed his sabotage. Master Haxel and the railroad executives trusted him completely, their confidence built on years of flawless performance that had never given them reason for doubt. But as Solomon shaped each piece with deliberate imperfection, he found himself thinking not just about the trains that would eventually derail, but about Samuel's children, who would grow up without their father because he had tried to teach them to read. He thought about his own son Marcus, playing innocently in their cabin while the forces of commerce and bondage calculated his future value as property. He thought about the baby that Celia carried, who would enter a world where their humanity was legally denied and their families could be destroyed by economic decisions made in boardrooms and auction houses. These thoughts sustained him through the moral complexity of his actions. Yes, innocent people might be hurt when his sabotaged infrastructure failed. But innocent people were being hurt every day by the system that his skills had been forced to support. The difference was that his resistance offered the possibility, however small, of striking back against the mechanisms of oppression. The final rail was completed on December 15, 1856. Solomon ran his hands along its smooth surface, feeling the subtle imperfections that would doom it to failure, knowing that this piece of iron represented months of careful planning, extraordinary risk, and the accumulated rage of a man who had finally decided to fight back in the only way available to him. Master Haxel examined the completed order that afternoon, his satisfaction evident in every gesture. "Magnificent work, Solomon," he declared, his voice carrying the pride of ownership. "The Virginia Central executives will be delighted. This shipment will cement Tredegar's reputation as the finest foundry in the South." "Thank you, sir," Solomon replied, maintaining the facade of grateful servitude while internally savoring the bitter irony of the compliment. As the rails and bridge supports were loaded onto wagons for transport to the construction sites, Solomon felt a mixture of anticipation and dread that made his hands tremble slightly. The next phase of his plan was now beyond his control. The sabotaged components would be installed according to the railroad schedule, tested according to their standard procedures, and deemed safe by engineers who had no reason to suspect that the iron they were examining contained the seeds of its own destruction. All Solomon could do now was wait, and hope that when his work finally revealed its true nature, the message would be clear enough for those who needed to understand it. Even in bondage, some men would never stop fighting for their freedom and the freedom of their families. Spring came early to Richmond in 1857, bringing with it news that filled Solomon with both satisfaction and terror. The Virginia Central Railroad's Danville extension had been completed on schedule, praised in newspapers throughout the South as an engineering marvel that would boost commerce and facilitate the efficient transport of both goods and human property to markets throughout the region. For 3 months, Solomon had watched and waited, maintaining his routine at the foundry while listening for any word about problems with the new railroad line. The trains had begun regular service in February, carrying lumber, tobacco, manufactured goods, and weekly shipments of enslaved people bound for the cotton fields and sugar plantations of the deeper South. The news came on a humid April morning, delivered not by official channels but through the underground network of communication that connected enslaved communities throughout Virginia. A field hand arriving with a delivery of coal brought whispered word that made Solomon's heart race with equal parts vindication and horror. There had been a derailment. The train had been carrying a full cargo of human property, nearly 200 enslaved men, women, and children being transported from Virginia's breeding farms to new owners in Georgia and Alabama. The locomotive had been traveling at normal speed on what appeared to be perfect track when the rails beneath it suddenly gave way, sending the engine and 4 cargo cars tumbling down a steep embankment into Difficult Creek. 7 people had died in the crash, but they were not the enslaved passengers Solomon had expected. The casualties included the train's conductor, 2 railroad officials who had been traveling in the passenger car, and 4 prominent Richmond businessmen who had been touring the new line to evaluate investment opportunities. The enslaved people, packed into reinforced cargo cars designed to prevent escape, had ironically been protected by the very constraints that bound them, suffering injuries but surviving in numbers that horrified their owners and delighted Solomon's conscience. More importantly, the derailment had occurred at the specific location Solomon had calculated, the steepest grade on the entire line, where his sabotaged rails would face maximum stress from a fully loaded train. The failure had been catastrophic and complete, destroying not just the immediate section of track but damaging the roadbed so severely that repairs would take months and cost thousands of dollars. But Solomon's satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that his actions had created new dangers for everyone around him. Railroad officials were conducting a thorough investigation of the crash, examining every piece of iron that had been used in the construction. Engineers were questioning the quality of materials supplied by various foundries, and Tredegar Ironworks was receiving scrutiny that made Master Haxel increasingly nervous and suspicious. "They're saying it might have been sabotage," Haxel announced to the assembled foundry workers during the midday break. His voice carried a coldness that Solomon had learned to recognize as a precursor to violence. Some abolitionist conspiracy to damage Southern commerce and transportation. Solomon maintained his expression of concerned surprise, but internally he marveled at the white man's inability to imagine that resistance might come from within their own system rather than from outside agitators. The possibility that an enslaved person might possess both the technical knowledge and moral courage to strike back against their oppressors seemed beyond Haxel's comprehension. "If I discover," Haxel continued, his eyes moving slowly across the faces of his workers, "that any of my property was involved in such treachery, the consequences will extend far beyond the guilty party. Families will be destroyed. Communities will be scattered. I will make an example that will be remembered for generations." The threat was clear and credible. Solomon had witnessed Haxel's capacity for calculated cruelty in the aftermath of Samuel's punishment. The man would not hesitate to destroy dozens of lives if he suspected even one person of disloyalty. That evening, Solomon found himself pacing the small space of his cabin while Celia nursed their 3-month-old daughter, Sarah, born in the depths of winter when the foundry's heat provided welcome relief from Richmond's cold. Marcus sat at their small table, practicing his letters with a piece of charcoal on a slate that Solomon had secretly acquired, a dangerous act given Samuel's fate, but one that seemed essential for his son's future. "You're worried about something," Celia observed, her voice kept low to avoid disturbing the baby. "More worried than usual." Solomon stopped pacing and looked at his wife, this woman who had borne 2 of his children and shared his life through years of uncertainty and fear. The knowledge of what he had done was a burden he carried alone, a secret too dangerous to share even with the person he trusted most in the world. "The railroad investigation," he said, which was true if incomplete. "They're looking for someone to blame, and we all know how these things usually end." Celia nodded, understanding the implications without further explanation. When disasters occurred in the South, enslaved people were often convenient scapegoats, regardless of any actual connection to the events in question. The mere suspicion of involvement could result in punishment, sale, or death. "Have you done anything that might draw their attention?" she asked, the question carrying no judgment but rather the practical concern of a woman who had learned to navigate the dangers of their existence. Solomon met her eyes directly, knowing that his answer would determine not just his own fate but the future of his family. If he confessed his sabotage, Celia would become complicit in his secret, sharing both the knowledge and the risk of discovery. If he remained silent, she would be protected from any accusations of prior knowledge, but he would face whatever consequences came alone. "I've only done my job," he said finally, the literal truth masking the deeper reality of what that job had become. As the investigation intensified over the following weeks, Solomon found his daily routine increasingly scrutinized. Railroad investigators visited the foundry repeatedly, examining records, questioning workers, and inspecting examples of recent work. They were particularly interested in the components that had failed during the derailment, tracing each piece back to its source and seeking any pattern that might explain the catastrophic breakdown. Solomon's reputation for excellence initially protected him from suspicion, but it also drew unwanted attention. The investigators were puzzled by the failure of rails that bore his mark, components that should have been among the strongest and most reliable on the entire line. "Your work is usually perfect," one of the investigators commented, running his hands along a rail that Solomon had forged the previous week. "The pieces that failed carried your mark, but they showed none of the obvious defects we might expect from inferior craftsmanship." "I take pride in my work, sir," Solomon replied, his voice carrying the humble deference expected of his position. "I can't explain why those rails failed, but I can promise you that everything I forge meets the highest standards." The investigator nodded, but Solomon could see doubt creeping into the man's expression. The technical impossibility of the failure, rails that appeared perfect but contained hidden structural weaknesses, was beginning to suggest possibilities that made everyone uncomfortable. As May arrived with its oppressive humidity, Solomon learned that the investigation was focusing increasingly on the possibility of deliberate sabotage. Railroad executives had brought in experts from Baltimore and Philadelphia, engineers who specialized in metallurgy and materials testing. These men possessed knowledge that rivaled Solomon's own understanding of iron and steel, and their examination methods were more sophisticated than anything previously applied to Southern Railroad construction. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when Solomon was shaping a routine order of horseshoes for a local stable. Master Haxel burst into the foundry with an expression of rage so intense that it silenced every hammer and conversation in the building. "They've found it," Haxel announced, his voice carrying across the sudden quiet like a whip crack. "The Baltimore engineers have identified microscopic flaws in the failed rails, deliberate imperfections that could only have been created by someone with extraordinary skill and intimate knowledge of metallurgy." Solomon's hands continued working the glowing horseshoe, but his mind raced through possibilities and calculations. The discovery had been inevitable, he realized. Given enough time and expertise, investigators would eventually understand the sophisticated nature of the sabotage. "Whoever did this," Haxel continued, "possessed not just the technical ability to create such flaws, but access to the railroad order and detailed knowledge of the installation schedule. This was not the work of some ignorant field hand or outside agitator. This was sabotage from within, performed by someone we trusted." The implications hung in the air like smoke from the forges. Every skilled worker in the foundry was now under suspicion, but Solomon's reputation for excellence and his involvement in the specific railroad order made him a natural focus for investigation. That afternoon, Solomon was summoned to Master Haxel's office, a wood-paneled room that smelled of tobacco and leather, its walls lined with contracts and correspondence from clients throughout the South. Two men Solomon didn't recognize sat in chairs facing Haxel's desk, their clothing and bearing marking them as the outside investigators he had heard about. "Solomon," Haxel began without preamble, "these gentlemen have some questions about the Virginia Central Railroad order. You will answer them completely and honestly." The taller of the two investigators, a man with graying hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several sheets of paper covered with technical drawings and calculations. "We've analyzed the failed rails extensively," the man said, his northern accent immediately marking him as an outsider in Richmond society. "The flaws we discovered could not have occurred through accident or incompetence. They required precise knowledge of metallurgy, careful control of forging temperatures, and deliberate manipulation of cooling processes." Solomon nodded respectfully, maintaining his facade of helpful cooperation while his mind worked through potential responses. "In your years of experience," the investigator continued, "how many men at this foundry would possess the skill necessary to create such sophisticated defects?" "Very few, sir," Solomon replied truthfully. "That kind of precise control requires years of experience and deep understanding of how iron behaves under different conditions. And you, of course, possess such knowledge." "Yes, sir. It's necessary for producing the quality of work that Master Haxel requires." The second investigator, younger and more aggressive in his manner, leaned forward in his chair. "We've spoken with railroad officials who specifically requested your work for the most critical components of the Danville line. They trusted your reputation for perfection." "I'm honored by their confidence, sir. Yet somehow, rails bearing your mark failed catastrophically, killing several prominent citizens and causing massive financial losses." Solomon met the man's accusatory gaze with carefully modulated surprise. "I can only say that I forged those rails to the same standards I've maintained for 12 years. If they failed, then something went wrong that I don't understand." The questioning continued for 2 hours, covering every aspect of the railroad order from initial specifications to final delivery. The investigators were thorough and intelligent, their questions designed to trap him in inconsistencies or contradictions. But Solomon had spent months preparing for this possibility, crafting explanations that would explain any suspicious circumstances without admitting guilt. When the session finally ended, Master Haxel dismissed him with words that carried ominous undertones. "You may return to work, Solomon. But understand that this matter is far from resolved." That evening, Solomon found his family's routine disrupted by visitors, other enslaved workers from the foundry who had come to offer support and share information about the ongoing investigation. The small cabin filled with familiar faces, men who had worked alongside Solomon for years and whose lives would be affected by whatever happened to him. "They questioned all of us today," reported James, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by serious concern. "Asking about your habits, your conversations, whether you'd ever expressed dissatisfaction with your situation." Abraham, the elder whose wisdom Solomon had sought months earlier, sat in the cabin's single chair and studied the younger man's face with eyes that seemed to see through all pretense. "You know," Abraham said quietly, his words directed at Solomon but audible to everyone present, "there comes a time in every man's life when he has to choose between safety and righteousness. The safe choice keeps your family fed and your back unwhipped. But sometimes, the righteous choice is the only one a man can make and still call himself human." The observation carried no explicit accusation, but Solomon understood that Abraham suspected the truth. The old man's words were both a warning and an expression of support, a recognition that resistance sometimes required sacrifices that extended beyond the individual making them. "Whatever happens," Abraham continued, "we look out for each other. That's always been our way, and it always will be." As the visitors departed and Solomon's family settled into their evening routine, he found himself contemplating the narrowing circle of his options. The investigation was closing in, and his technical expertise, the very skill that had made his sabotage possible, was now pointing suspicion directly at him. But even as he faced the growing likelihood of discovery, Solomon felt no regret for his actions. The derailment had accomplished exactly what he had intended, disrupting the transport of enslaved people, causing significant financial losses to the railroad company, and demonstrating that the system of bondage was vulnerable to attack from within. More importantly, the crash had saved nearly 200 people from being sold into the hell of Deep South plantation labor. Those men, women, and children were now back in Virginia, their transport indefinitely delayed while the railroad rebuilt its damaged infrastructure. Some would eventually be sold elsewhere, but others might benefit from the breathing space created by his sabotage, time for escape attempts, for family reunions, for the small mercies that sometimes emerged from large disruptions. The price of that success was becoming clear, but Solomon had accepted it months ago when he first conceived his plan. He had always known that resistance would come with consequences, that striking back against the system would invite retaliation against himself and potentially his family. The final confrontation came 3 days later, when Master Haxel arrived at the foundry accompanied by the county sheriff and a warrant for Solomon's arrest. The formal charges were sabotage, destruction of property, and conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism against the Commonwealth of Virginia, crimes that carried the death penalty under state law. "Solomon Hayes," the sheriff announced as the entire foundry fell silent, "you are under arrest for the willful destruction of Virginia Central Railroad property and the murders of 7 citizens of this Commonwealth." Solomon set down his hammer and turned to face his accusers, his movements deliberate and dignified. He had prepared for this moment for months, knowing that it would eventually come, steeling himself for what would follow. As iron shackles closed around his wrists, Solomon looked across the foundry floor at the faces of men who had been his colleagues, his friends, his community for more than a decade. In their eyes, he saw fear, sadness, and something else, a recognition that his resistance had been undertaken not just for himself, but for all of them. "I want you all to witness this," Master Haxel announced to the assembled workers. "This is what happens to property that forgets its place, that presumes to act against its owner's interests. Let Solomon Hayes serve as an example of the consequences of ingratitude and treachery." But as Solomon was led away from the foundry, past the forges where he had spent countless hours transforming raw iron into finished products, he understood that his example would carry a different message than Haxel intended. His resistance had demonstrated that even within the constraints of slavery, human agency persisted. Even in bondage, some men would continue to fight for their freedom and the freedom of their people. The trial that followed was a foregone conclusion. The evidence against Solomon was overwhelming. Technical analysis of the sabotaged rails, testimony from railroad officials, and his own expertise that made him the only plausible suspect. The proceedings lasted 3 days, during which prosecutors painted him as an ungrateful slave who had betrayed his master's trust and murdered innocent citizens. Solomon's defense attorney, appointed by the court but obviously reluctant to represent him zealously, offered only token resistance to the charges. The man seemed more interested in minimizing the disruption to his practice than in mounting a serious defense of an enslaved person accused of capital crimes. On the final day of testimony, Solomon was permitted to speak in his own defense, a formality that everyone understood would have no impact on the verdict. He stood before the all-white jury and spoke words that would be remembered long after his death. "I stand before you not as property that has malfunctioned, but as a human being who chose to resist his own dehumanization. I used the skills you forced me to develop against the system that enslaved me, turning my expertise into a weapon for justice rather than profit. Yes, I sabotaged those rails. I did it to save nearly 200 people from being sold into the hell of Deep South slavery. I did it to strike back at a system that treats human beings like livestock, that separates families for profit, that denies the basic humanity of millions of people. You call me a murderer, but I say that slavery itself is murder, the murder of the human spirit, the murder of families, the murder of hope. Every day, this system kills people who never appear in your newspapers or your court records. Every auction block is a site of murder. Every whipping post is an instrument of death. I am guilty of the charges against me, but I am not ashamed. I am proud to have used my abilities in service of justice rather than oppression. When you hang me, remember that you are executing a man who chose resistance over submission, freedom over safety, righteousness over survival." The verdict was delivered within an hour, guilty on all charges. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out in 1 month's time in the public square where Richmond conducted its executions. But Solomon's final act of resistance was yet to come. During his month in prison, word of his case spread throughout Virginia's enslaved communities, carried by the invisible network of communication that connected plantations, farms, and urban centers across the state. His story became legend, the tale of a skilled craftsman who had used his expertise to strike back at the system that enslaved him. More importantly, his technical knowledge did not die with him. In whispered conversations in slave quarters, in coded messages passed between plantations, in the oral traditions that preserved dangerous knowledge across generations, the details of his sabotage methods survived. Other skilled workers learned how subtle flaws could be introduced into iron and steel, how infrastructure could be weakened from within, how reputation and trust could become weapons against oppression. On the morning of his execution, Solomon walked to the gallows with the same dignity he had brought to his forge work, his resistance, and his trial. A crowd of nearly 2,000 people gathered to witness the hanging, white citizens who saw the event as justice served, and enslaved people who understood they were watching a hero die. His final words, spoken from the gallows platform, carried across the silent crowd, "My body belongs to you, but my spirit remains free. The iron I forged may have failed when I intended it to, but the example I set will endure. Others will follow. Others will resist. The system you believe is permanent will fall, because human beings cannot be permanently enslaved." The rope ended Solomon Hayes's life on June 15, 1857, but his story continued to inspire resistance throughout the antebellum period and beyond. Railroad companies began implementing new inspection procedures for their iron supplies, unknowingly acknowledging the effectiveness of his methods. Foundries increased security and oversight of their skilled workers, tacit recognition that knowledge itself had become a threat to the system of bondage. Most importantly, Solomon's example demonstrated that resistance could take many forms, that even within the constraints of slavery, human agency could find expression. His sabotage had required not just courage but intelligence, patience, and technical expertise, qualities that enslaved people possessed in abundance but were rarely permitted to deploy against their oppressors. In the months following his execution, railroad accidents throughout the South increased dramatically, though investigators could never determine whether these incidents resulted from copycat sabotage or mere coincidence. What was certain was that the story of Solomon Hayes had planted seeds of resistance that would continue to grow until the entire system of bondage collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. His wife Celia and their children were sold to a North Carolina plantation owner 3 months after the execution, their separation serving as a final punishment for Solomon's defiance. But even in their forced exile, they carried his memory and his example, passing down to future generations the story of a man who had chosen resistance over submission, who had transformed his skills from tools of oppression into weapons of liberation. Years later, when the Civil War finally brought an end to legal slavery in America, freed people throughout the South would remember Solomon Hayes as one of the first to demonstrate that the system could be fought from within, that knowledge and expertise could become instruments of resistance, and that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit would find ways to strike back against injustice. The forge at Tredegar Iron Works continued to burn for decades after Solomon's death, but it never again produced iron quite as reliable as what he had crafted during his final months of freedom disguised as bondage. His true masterwork had not been the perfect rails he had forged during his years of loyalty, but the flawed ones he had created in service of a higher justice. Iron that failed precisely when and where it was supposed to, carrying within its molecular structure the promise that oppression, no matter how well constructed, would eventually collapse under the weight of human resistance. In the end, Solomon Hayes had achieved something that few enslaved people could claim. He had chosen the manner of his death, and in doing so, he had reclaimed his humanity from a system designed to strip it away. His execution had been intended as a warning to others, but instead became a rallying cry for resistance that echoed through the remaining years of American slavery and beyond. The last iron Solomon Hayes ever forged was not made of metal, but of memory and inspiration, an alloy of courage and sacrifice that proved more durable than any physical material, more reliable than any infrastructure, and more enduring than the system of bondage it was designed to resist. The story of Solomon Hayes represents the countless acts of resistance, both large and small, that enslaved African Americans undertook throughout the antebellum period. While Solomon himself is a fictional character, his actions reflect the real experiences of skilled enslaved workers who used their expertise to resist the system that bound them. The Tredegar Iron Works was indeed Richmond's largest foundry and employed hundreds of enslaved workers whose skills were essential to the South's industrial development. Many of these workers possessed technical knowledge that rivaled or exceeded that of their white overseers, yet their expertise served to enrich others while they remained in bondage. Railroad sabotage by enslaved people was documented throughout the antebellum period, though the sophisticated metallurgical methods attributed to Solomon Hayes in this narrative represent an amalgamation of various resistance techniques rather than historically verified specific practices. What is certain is that enslaved people found numerous ways to disrupt the infrastructure that sustained their oppression, from work slowdowns and tool sabotage to more dramatic acts of resistance. The legal and social responses to slave resistance depicted in this story accurately reflect the harsh realities of antebellum Virginia law and custom. Enslaved people accused of serious crimes faced swift justice in courts that offered little pretense of fair representation. Public executions served as both punishment and deterrent, designed to terrorize enslaved communities into compliance. Yet, as Solomon Hayes' story illustrates, the human spirit's capacity for resistance proved impossible to extinguish entirely. Throughout the dark years of American slavery, individuals continued to find ways to assert their humanity, protect their families, and strike back against the system that sought to reduce them to property. Their courage, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to freedom ultimately contributed to the downfall of the institution that enslaved them, proving that even the most oppressive systems cannot permanently suppress the fundamental human desire for liberty and dignity. If these untold stories of defiance and survival stir your soul, join our community. Subscribe to Channel Name to uncover more hidden truths from the shadows of American slavery. Your support helps us keep these powerful narratives alive.